Professor Chomsky, at the outset, let us say how grateful we are that you agreed to hold this discussion with us. We have been able to follow your talks at MIT and publications on 20th century and contemporary politics. Your opinions on totalitarian cultures in free societies, popular movements, and the role of intellectuals have stimulated us to consider a possible comparison between the former Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc. Today, we propose to discuss a set of questions, many of which are reformulations of your thesis on the so-called propaganda model.
In many of your interviews and publications, you have emphasized the role of the propaganda model for shaping the socio-political processes in the United States. Could you please share your opinion on the genealogy of this model and on its effectiveness, as compared especially with its counterparts in the 20th century? For example, we would like to hear more about the importance of the historical sources of propaganda in the United States, such as the Creel Committee before 1920 and Edward Bernays afterwards, especially in light of the proceedings of psychoanalysis. Besides, would it possibly prove enlightening to juxtapose this model with the German one?
The Nazi one? Yeah. Well, that's the easiest part, and I'll start with that. Because Goebbels quite explicitly said that he was taking over the approach of American commercial advertising, which he found very effective and very useful, so he just adapted that to their own purposes. You know, short, snappy slogans, repeating the same lies over and over again, emotional appeals, a whole variety of things. So I don't think there was very much difference, just a different adaptation to different purposes. The commercial advertising was one of the, not the only, but one of the outgrowths of the development of propaganda, primarily in the early 20th century. In those days, incidentally, it was just called propaganda. So the main original kind of founding textbook of the public relations industry by Edward Bernays is just called propaganda. Propaganda just meant what it still means in some other languages, just persuasion. During the 1930s, particularly, propaganda took on a kind of a bad connotation. So today in English, propaganda is only used, the term propaganda is only used for the propaganda of enemies. Our own propaganda is not called propaganda. In some languages, there's even sharper distinctions. So for example, in Israeli Hebrew, there was a word propaganda, which is used for everybody's propaganda. But now that word is also only used for the propaganda of enemies. Now, their own propaganda has the interesting word, hasbara, which literally means explanation. The assumption being that our propaganda is so obviously correct that all we have to do is explain it to people, and then they'll see that it's correct. So propaganda, and that's kind of the sense here. We don't, in English, you don't use the word propaganda anymore for what's would have been called propaganda 70 or 80 years ago. So I'll use the term in the traditional sense, anybody's propaganda. That began about a century ago, and I mean, always existed, of course, but it became institutionalized as a serious endeavor around the beginning of the 20th century, and rather strikingly in the freest countries in the world, in England and the United States. And there was a reason, which was pretty conscious and sometimes stated. The reason was that enough freedom had been won by popular struggles so that it was hard to control people by force. And when you can't control people by coercion and one or another means of violence or force, you have to turn to other techniques of control. And the obvious other technique is control of attitudes and opinions. Well, that's propaganda. The first kind of official propaganda agency was in Britain before the First World War, and it had the natural Orwellian name Ministry of Information. The goal of the British Ministry of Information was to convince the world of the nobility of Britain's cause, particularly with the Second World War, the First World War looming. But the main target was American intellectuals, and that was for very liberal intellectuals primarily, for good reason. The British understood that if they're going to survive the war or prevail, they're going to have the support of the United States. And the United States was neutralist and pretty much pacifist. So something had to be done to drive the United States towards war. Direct participation in the First World War was crucial for Britain's survival, actually. So they directed themselves to the right people, the intellectual elite, who they felt could mobilize the population by their own propaganda. And it worked like a charm. If you look at the liberal progressive elite in the United States, John Dewey's circle, the Republic, the liberal journals, they were very completely taken by British propaganda. They regarded it as their own discovery. It's the best propaganda. You make people think they're discovering it for themselves. And they accepted all these stories about Belgian babies with their arms torn off, and the rest of the stuff that was exposed by the British Rice Commission years later. And they convinced themselves that they became very pro-war, and they convinced themselves that that the U.S. involvement in the First World War was a particularly noble endeavor, as they put it. This is the first time that war was brought about not by reactionary militarists and bishops and terrible people like that, but by the intelligent minority who observed the situation carefully, made a rational calculation, and decided that war is in the best interest of humanity. So, and then convinced the population to go along. That was their self-image. And it was no small task, because the population was pacifist. In fact, Woodrow Wilson won the election in 1916 on the platform peace without victory. So let's bring peace to the warring nations of Europe from our superior perspective. Within months, it became victory without peace. And they had to bring the population along, and it worked. Within a short period of time, the American population became hysterically anti-German. I mean, to the extent, say, that the Boston Symphony Orchestra couldn't play Beethoven, I mean, things like that. It just became total hysteria. And the liberal intellectuals were very proud of that. They thought they had shown that intelligence can bring about proper social change. That led to ideas about, how to run the economy intelligently and so on. Well, Woodrow Wilson had his own propaganda agency, which included primarily liberal intellectuals, businessmen, and so on. It was called also the Committee on Public Information. It's shorthand. It's called the Creel Commission because of the person in charge. So it's like the British. It's a Ministry of Information. That's propaganda, in other words. And the Creel Commission had on it, it was regarded itself probably was effective in mobilizing a pacifist population and turning them into fanatic haters of anything German. It did succeed in that. On the Creel Commission, there were some people who became quite influential in two domains. One was Edward Bernays, who you mentioned. The other was Walter Lippmann, became the leading public intellectual of the 20th century in the English-speaking world. Both of them, incidentally, were what are called progressives. They were Wilson, Roosevelt, Kennedy liberals, and did many things. But we're keeping here to the lessons that they quite explicitly drew from the Creel Commission. Both of them wrote that they had discovered from their work on the commission that it is possible to control thought and attitudes. And that's very important because for the benefit of everyone, we must make sure that the general population does not interfere in affairs of state, in important things. It's none of their business. As Lippmann put it, the population are supposed to be spectators and not participants. They're allowed to do something in the United States every 4 years. They're allowed to put their weight behind one or another member of the elite class, and then they're supposed to go home and keep to their own business. And that's extremely important, because if they interfere, they'll do all kind of terrible things. Policy has to be in the hands of the intelligent minority. Incidentally, all of this is very Leninist. You can take Lenin, I've done it occasionally, and compare it with pronouncement by liberal American intellectuals. And it's a little bit difference in rhetoric. So the American intellectuals sometimes talk about God or something like that, but the basic ideas are essentially the same. And I think they have essentially the same roots. The idea that an intelligent minority, who of course always includes us, whoever is speaking, must, for the benefit of everyone, take control and make sure that the rabble stays out of our hair. This all goes back to the earliest democratic revolution in England in the 17th century. In the 1640s, there was a civil war in England between king and parliament. But there was also a proliferation. There were radical preachers, itinerant preachers, pamphlets. It was a very radical, popular movement. And it appalled the gentry, the men of best quality, as they called themselves. They were appalled at the idea that these ordinary people were saying that they didn't want to fight either for king or parliament. They hated both of them. They didn't want to, I'm quoting now, they didn't want to be run by knights and gentlemen who do but oppress us. We want to be governed by countrymen like ourselves who know the people's sores. And that idea was utterly appalling to the gentry of democratic England in the 17th century, and the same right until today. The idea that you should be governed by countrymen like yourselves who know the people's sores, inconceivable. Out of both Lippmann and Bernays, these two wings kind of, not alone of course, but representing the two wings of how the propaganda system developed, you have on the one hand the effort to control beliefs, the doctrine, commitments. On the other hand, what became commercial advertising, the attempt to simply marginalize people, direct them to what were called the business literature, the superficial things of life, like fashionable consumption. Because you can trap people into identifying their own self-worth with the number of, say, iPads or whatever today's thing may be, then you got them trapped. And that's basically what the huge advertising industry is about, trapping people. The other half, the kind of Lippmann half, if you like, is trying to impose beliefs and so on. What are you supposed to believe? What are the right doctrines? Just how well that works is a difficult question. When you mention the propaganda model, it's really about what they're attempting to do. The question of how well it succeeds is a separate question. Sometimes yes, sometimes not. The distraction aspect, commercial advertising, works extremely well. That's why you have what's called a consumer society. And there's a huge amount of money that goes into it. The existence of advertising itself is an indication of the decline of markets. In a market system, you don't have advertising. And if you go back to the late 19th century America, when something approximating a market, small producers, and so on, then there was almost no advertising, just information. Here's what I have for sale. If you like it, buy it. As you get oligopoly, concentration of capital, control over production, consumption, organized control, then the producers, they don't want to have a competition, because competition, like price wars, they don't want price wars. It undercuts profit. So you have to do something else. You get what's called product differentiation. So in order to sell cars, you don't cut down on their price. What you do is change something superficial, like, what do they look like? If they have tail fins and so on. And then you have to delude people into buying one rather than the other, because they're all basically identical. And how do you delude people? Well, that's advertising. So if you, take an economics course, they tell you that markets are based on informed consumers making rational choices. But all you have to do is turn on the television set, and you can see that hundreds of millions of dollars are being spent on trying to create irrational consumers, who uninformed consumers make irrational choices. That's what advertising is. And the idea, and it's the intensity of the efforts are staggering. So, for example, a couple of years ago, advertisers noticed that there's a part of the population they're not reaching, who don't have any money, namely children. Now, we can't let that happen, so we have to figure out ways of controlling children. And the way to do it, they discovered, is by trying to train children to nag their parents. So you take a look at children's television, down to infants, 2 years old. It's efforts to try to make a child think that unless I have this thing, which Johnny has, I'm no good, And then they sort of go after the parents and annoy them and irritate them, and finally the parents buy it, and then you throw it away a couple of days later. And they're big. It's a huge, even academic psychology has studies of nagging. How do you nag differently for different purposes and so on. The idea is there can't be anything left out. Everything has to be controlled and diverted. That's commercial advertising. More normal propaganda in the more normal sense is trying to impose beliefs and attitudes. In our book, The Propaganda Model, we mostly discussed that, but the commercial advertising part is extremely significant. Actually, that's the way elections are run now in the United States. The elections are run by the advertising industry, essentially. And if you look at an election, it keeps away from issues. Candidates keep away from issues. It's important because the public disagrees with policymakers on most issues, so keep away from that. And the idea is to create, it's kind of like undermining markets. You want to create uninformed voters who will make irrational decisions, like pick this one rather than that one because of some superficial thing. Like in Obama's case, there's a lot of emphasis on what's called his soaring rhetoric. That's like advertising for cars. A football player showing off the car, that's soaring rhetoric. It means you're not saying anything. And it's important not to say anything because what you say happens to be opposed by the population, so don't say that. In fact, the advertising industry understands it very well. The political scientists intellectuals pretend not to understand it, but the advertisers do. So immediately after Obama's election in 2008, the advertising huge industry had its annual conference, and every year they give an award for the best marketing campaign of the year. And they gave it to Obama that year. He beat out Apple computers, and a lot of euphoria and executive suites. We got a new model for deluding people and so on. So they know pretty much what they're doing. It's only the intellectuals who have a task of pretending that something serious is going on. Free country, everyone has a choice, and so on and so forth. But if you go back to, say, Bernays and Lippmann, they were pretty straight, if you read what they say. You have to delude and control people. Bernays called it engineering of consent. Lippmann called it manufacture of consent for their own good. Just as you don't allow a child to run into the street, you have to hold them back. So the general public, the ignorant and meddlesome outsiders, as Lippmann called them, have to be kept out of the public arena. We have to regiment their minds the way an army regiments its soldiers. It's Bernays. And that's essentially what's done with these kind of two dimensions. Consciously, one of the leading founders of modern political science, Harold Lasswell, also a progressive intellectual, he wrote that one of the founding texts, academic texts, that we should not succumb to democratic dogmatisms about people being the best judges of their own interests. They're not, we are. Straight Leninist. They're not the best judges, we're the best judges for their benefit. We're going to control them, but of course we have to make them either believe what we're saying, that's manufacture of consent, or else just be diverted, like pick up pointless commodities, superficial things, and so on, and atomize the society so people can't get together, and so on and so forth. And this is a huge part of modern society. And it's necessary, because if you actually look at attitudes, they're quite different from policy. It's striking in the United States, where it's well studied. It's more studied here than it is in most countries. So we have a lot of information about it. But on the most crucial issues, the population just doesn't agree with policy. There's a huge gap between policy and opinion. So, for example, right now, say the major domestic issue right now is, for the public, the major domestic issue is joblessness, loss of jobs, which makes sense. There's 20 million people without jobs, many millions more who've given up, huge numbers who don't have the kind of jobs that their skills warrant, and so on. And it's not that there's no work to be done. There's tons of work to be done. It's not that there's no resources. Corporate profits are just going through the ceiling. There's plenty of resources, plenty of work to be done, plenty of idle hands who want to work, but you can't put them together because it's not profitable enough. And the public knows it. Maybe they don't know all the details, but that's their conclusion. On the other hand, for the banks and the elites and the wealthy and so on, what's important is budget deficits. They don't want the risk of potential inflation, which is bad for lenders and so on. So what do we have? Budget deficit. There's a sequester now, which is harming the economy, but it's not because of jobs. It's because of deficits, which is a non-existent problem. I mean, literally a non-existent problem, except important to the wealthy and the financial institutions and so on. And you have this case after case. I won't go through the details, but for these reasons, you really need the basic two kinds of propaganda. I mean, you mentioned psychoanalysis, and that is brought up because Bernays happened to be Freud's son-in-law. But I don't think there's much to it, frankly. For one thing, I don't think psychoanalysis has much to say about any of this. And for another, because the basic ideas are just kind of elementary. The kinds I described, the kinds that Goebbels perceived, and that worked well. Incidentally, the Bolsheviks also tried to adopt American commercial propaganda, but they did such a clumsy job of it that nobody believed them. If you read something in Pravda, you assume the opposite is true. But the Nazis, unfortunately, were quite successful.
To expand a bit more on precisely this point, let us compare the United States and the USSR with regard to their media. You know that central media in the United States were slow to report on the East Timor genocide and to adequately qualify US's military interventions, such as in Vietnam, whereas the Soviet media, for example Pravda, deem USSR's entry in Afghanistan an invasion quite early on.
Yeah, actually, late is a little bit of an understatement. They never did, and still don't today, on East Timor, and many other things. But it's true. I mean, like right now happens to be the 10th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq. Can you read anything suggesting that George Bush and Tony Blair should be brought to trial and as major war criminals? I mean, they obviously should. by the principles that the U.S. upholds, like the principles of Nuremberg, foundations of modern international law. They're major war criminals. You take a look at Iraq today; it's a total wreck. Society's devastated. The cultural, educational systems destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of corpses, millions of people displaced. Huge internal conflict generated by the invasion, Shiite Sunni conflict, which is spreading over the region. So I mean, not only was it a major crime to begin with, but the results are horrendous. You see anything about it in the press? No. That's maybe there was some mistakes. Anybody can make mistakes. If you read, say, Obama is considered an anti-war critic. Why? Because he said it was a strategic blunder. Kind of like Russian generals in Afghanistan by the early 1980s were saying, look, this is a blunder, but we don't honor them as great anti-war critics. Or let's say German generals after Stalingrad, they recognized that a two-front war is a strategic blunder, but we don't hold them up as heroes, But in our case, you can't have anything more than mistake, naivete, and so on. So yes, that's normal. On the other hand, it is kind of interesting that there were, in Russia, in the 80s, and by then, there was the beginnings of, even before it became official, there were beginnings of something like perestroika. There were surprising deviations. There was one quite interesting case when a Russian, I think, radio reporter, Vladimir Danchev was his name, for 5 successive days, I think it was, it gave blistering denunciations of the Russian invasion of Afghanistan over, I think, national radio. And finally he was taken off and sent to some mental health institution or something or other, and rehabilitated and brought back. Well, this got a lot of publicity in the United States for interesting reasons. It wasn't because he was publicly exposing the crimes, something which couldn't happen here. You couldn't possibly have anyone on CBS, let's say, giving talks like that. It's inconceivable. That part was ignored. It was that he was suppressed. Now, we don't suppress journalists here. We don't send them to mental institutions. And in fact, it's unnecessary because they're not critical. But if they were, they wouldn't have a job. In fact, it would never happen because the indoctrination is much too deep. So there was a kind of quite an interesting incident. There are some studies that are kind of striking. During the 1970s, the U.S. government there were a lot of emigres by then, was trying to get some idea what ordinary Russians, where do they get their information from? What do they know about the world? And there were studies by the government and academic Russian research centers, and the results were suggestive. I mean, it turned out that they divided Russians into 2 categories, the more educated and working class. And among the more educated, it turned out, I think about 95% of them were getting their information from outlets like BBC, World Service, and among the ordinary population, it was maybe 3/4 or something like that. Now, they also found that the samizdat, which were technically illegal, were reaching maybe 50% of the educated and fair percent of the rest of the population. Now, that's quite interesting. You compare it with the United States, the number of people who read anything outside of standard U.S., say, listen to BBC, is practically 0. Samizdat, the equivalent of samizdat, will reach a couple of thousand people. So the conclusion from this seems not the conclusion that was drawn, but the conclusion that it actually suggests is that the Russians were just a lot more informed about the world than Americans were. And the reason probably was that the Russian propaganda system was so clumsy that it just had no impact, because people just couldn't take it serious. I mean, some people took it seriously, of course, but a lot of people just regarded as ridiculous. It's too clumsy. You can't beat people over the head with ridiculous propaganda and expect them to believe it. The American systems, British systems, Western in general, are much more sophisticated, much more refined. And how much they convince people, we don't know, but at least they kind of more or less limit them within certain bounds. And among the educated, they work very well. So, for example, you virtually can't get a fundamental critique, the kind of critique of crimes that we would automatically use against others are almost inconceivable to ourselves.
Let us also discuss the assassination attempt on Pope John Paul II in Rome in 1981 and its alleged KGB Bulgarian connection. In your book with Professor Edward Herman, Manufacturing Consent, it is claimed that it provided the basis for one of the most successful propaganda campaigns during the Cold War era. Could you comment on the way in which the crimes reporting in Western media illustrates what Professor Herman and you call the propaganda model?
Yeah. Actually, this is mostly Herman's work, and I mean, I've read it, of course. But what happened is that there was an assassination attempt against the Pope, almost certainly by a Turkish Nazi, member of what was called the Grey Wolves, a kind of neo-Nazi Turkish ultranationalist organization. But it was immediately blamed on communists. That's reflexive. Whatever happens, you blame it on today's enemy, whoever it may happen to be. So this is, then it was the evil communists, so blame it on them. And then came the Bulgarian connection. You know, the KGB did it, they used Bulgarian intelligence, a big story concocted, and most of it fell apart as soon as anybody looked at it. But it was effective. It did deflect attention towards the evils of communism. That's done on just about any example you pick up, doesn't matter what it was. And often it, sometimes, I mean, there are cases which in my view are more dramatic. So for example, if the U.S. wanted to invade a country, say Guatemala, overthrow the government, Cuba after Castro, first thing to do was to try to show that it's just an outpost of the communists. And incidentally here, Bernays was very effective. One of his great propaganda campaigns, of which he was very proud, was in 1954, when the United States CIA overturned the democratic government in Guatemala, replaced it by a military dictatorship, which has led to a horror story that's going on until the present, 60 years already. It was necessary to show that it's not a democratic government, it's really a communist outpost. And Bernays was assigned the task to develop the propaganda for this, and it was pretty effective, actually, and he was quite proud of it. Later, the head of the United Fruit Company was involved. The government was redistributing lands to peasants and introducing peasant participation in government. They couldn't tolerate that. And the company, the United Fruit Company, had lots of unused lands that they wanted to keep, so they were a large part behind it. The PR officer of United Fruit, Thomas McCann, was asked later, after the lies, they were terrible, ridiculous lies, after they were kind of exposed, if he didn't think there was something wrong with lying to journalists. And his answer was correct. He said, look, they were so eager for the experience that we didn't even have to try. They wanted to be lied to so that they could then fortify their own belief that it's the evil communists, and what the U.S. is doing is just defending the country from communists. I mean, it went to the point of trying to compel the Guatemalan government to get arms from East Europe. Then you could say, oh, they're a communist outpost. So what was done was, of course, block all arms to the government and start there was an invasion coming. They needed arms. coerce allies so that they won't send them arms. So then maybe if we're lucky, they'll get arms from Czechoslovakia. As soon as that happened, then okay, communist outpost. Actually, they tried this with Cuba and with Nicaragua, but they had seen what happened, so they didn't fall for it, But so they made it up anyway. So, for example, in 1984, when Reagan wanted to disrupt the Nicaraguan elections, they concocted a story about MiG jet planes being delivered to Nicaragua, and that displaced any talk about the election. So the election disappeared, and it never took place. So it, of course, took place, and the big talk about the MiGs. And there were a couple of people at the liberal end, liberal congressmen, who were suspicious and said maybe there really aren't any MiGs, but Dodd, Tsongas, a couple of others, but they said if MiGs are being delivered, then we have to bomb them, because we can't allow any country near us to have Russian planes. We have planes all over around Russia, but that's different. So we got to bomb them if they're real, but maybe they're not real. And that eliminated, to this day, there's no recognition that an election took place. And it was a well-studied election, highly praised by international observers, but couldn't take place because we're attacking the country. It's got to be a communist outpost. These things do work. The KGB Bulgarian case was a striking case in point. And by the time it was all exposed as lies, everybody had forgotten about it.
We would also be interested in discussing the role of an important echelon in contemporary societies, the intelligentsia, as well as educated classes more broadly. In the Soviet Union, for instance, it has asserted itself as a key component of the dissident movement. What is, in your opinion, its role in the United States over the past century? Besides, you have pointed out that there was an astonishingly high interest in alternative and foreign news feeds among educated people in USSR, especially as opposed to the USA.
Well, I think you're repeating a propaganda line. If you take a look at the intellectuals in Russia, overwhelmingly they were supportive of state power. Overwhelmingly. Scientists, non-scientists. They were just either passive, we'll do our work and shut up, or supported the worst atrocities. There was a fringe of dissidents. And they're the only dissidents in fact, the term dissident is, in English, is used for East European dissidents. Like dissidents in Central America aren't called dissidents. Okay. In fact, in, say, in Latin America, which is counterpart to Eastern Europe, there was a much more courageous, active dissident movement, and they were treated much more brutally than they were in Eastern Europe. So, for example, Havel was jailed for a couple of months or something, which shouldn't be done, but his counterparts in El Salvador just had their brains blown out by U.S.-trained military forces. And it's kind of known to scholarship that in the post-Stalin era, we don't call them dissidents, but dissidents in Latin America were treated far more harshly than anything that happened in Eastern Europe. But the term dissident is restricted to East European dissidents. And they were courageous, honorable people, way out at the fringe, very few of them. And they were treated pretty badly, not as badly as in Latin America, but pretty badly. And that's the norm. But notice that they're the only dissidents, I think probably in history, who were supported by massive power. They were idolized in the West because they're opposing our major enemy. If you wanted to be, say, a British intellectual, if you wanted to feel noble and honorable, you'd go to Czechoslovakia to talk to dissidents, which is fine. I mean, I tried to get into, but the visa was denied. So it's okay to do it, but it's not a very heroic act. Now, if you want to do something serious, you'd go to El Salvador and talk to the Jesuit intellectuals who were getting murdered. That would be serious, but of course it's not done. And one result is that the Eastern European intellectuals think of themselves as the people who suffered most in the world. I mean, it's very interesting to read, and you can see why. They're lauded in the West, they're idolized, their suffering, which was real, is endlessly lamented, and they've kind of come to internalize it. And you see it in very striking ways. So just to give you one example, in 1989, immediately after the fall of the Berlin Wall, one in El Salvador, which is kind of U.S. counterpart to Russia's Czechoslovakia, one of the elite battalions, which had already killed tens of thousands of people, was brought to the United States for special training, extra training at the John F. Kennedy School of Counterinsurgency. They then went back to El Salvador, and immediately they got orders from the High Command, which is in close contact with the American Embassy. The orders were to break into the university and to murder 6 leading Latin American intellectuals, Jesuit priests, and anybody who else was around, so there wouldn't be any witnesses. So their housekeeper and their daughter, there's an artistic depiction of it up there by a Jesuit priest. And they did it, of course. And it was, the U.S. Embassy pretended they didn't know anything about it, and it was all, maybe somebody that didn't have anything to do with what actually, they denied it. It was kind of forgotten. Václav Havel came to the United States shortly after that. He was given, he spoke to a joint session of Congress, where he was given a rousing ovation, everybody, because he referred to the United States as defenders of freedom. The defenders of freedom had just been responsible for the brutal murder of half a dozen of his counterparts, let alone tens of thousands of other people, but they were defenders of freedom. And you read the American press, they were just awed by this. So why can't we have magnificent intellectuals like this who call us defenders of freedom when we go around assassinating people and carrying out atrocities? Magnificent. And Anthony Lewis, a critic in the New York Times, said we're in a romantic age. It's just marvelous. And I suppose Havel internalized it. It is inconceivable that, say, Father Eocharia, one of the rector of the university, was murdered. Inconceivable that he would have gone to Russia and spoken at the Duma and said, "You're the defenders of freedom." I mean, absolutely inconceivable. They had sympathy and respect for counterparts in Eastern Europe. It's not reciprocated.
Professor Chomsky, we had in mind a comparison between the scientific intelligentsia in the USSR, people like Sakharov, with the scientific intelligentsia here.
It's the same here. I mean, of course, in the United States, they're not treated as badly as they were in the Soviet Union, though in Latin America they were treated much worse. But there are dissident physicists here. The difference is the reaction, but it's fundamentally the same. Furthermore, it goes through history. This is a model that's reciprocated over and over again, all through history. The large majority of the intellectuals are subservient to power. There's usually a fringe of dissidents that are treated pretty badly. Now it depends on the society. I don't think there's any fundamental difference.